There's once a factory, and at the gate of the factory, there was a guard. And the guard's job was to stop the workers when they left the factory, because they were handling valuable tools and materials in the factory. The guard was meant to stop them pinching stuff, was meant to stop them doing anything with the company property. This particular worker with dirty overalls walked up to the gate, and he had a wheelbarrow, and it was piled up with sawdust and wood shavings. And the guard thinks, okay, I need to search this guy properly and make sure there isn't anything strange going on. So he looks at this dirty man and his dirty wheelbarrow, and he searches through the wood shavings. He pats the man down and searches him quite carefully, even looking under his hat. And he can't find anything, so he lets the man go on his way. The next day, the same thing happens. And he searches the man again, can't find anything wrong. Lets him go on his way. For a couple of weeks, this situation repeats itself. Now, the guard is a man who, he is what we might call a bit OCD. He likes an orderly life, and he can't really cope with this open question of what the guy is doing. And he notices the guy also has a new car that he seems to be arriving to work in. And so he searches him even more carefully over the next couple of weeks. And by this time, a couple of months have gone by, and the guy is coming with his dirty overalls, with his dirty wheelbarrow, and with the wood shavings and the sawdust from the workshops. And the guard has searched him so many times, he's close to giving up. The problem is that because the guard has become a little bit fixated on what the guy is doing, he can't get to sleep at night. He's staying awake at night, wondering and asking himself, what am I missing? What's the guy doing? And because he's staying awake late at night, he begins to oversleep. And he's not got the kindest boss at work. And his boss says to him, look, if you're late for work again from oversleeping, you're going to lose your job. And his wife hears this, and she says she's not the kindest wife. And she says to him, look, if you lose your job because you oversleep, because you're staying awake about this puzzle, then I'm going to leave you. Not very kind, is it? So the guy is in a bit of a fix. He doesn't know how to find out his way out of it. He doesn't know what to do. So he stops the guy the next day who comes with the dirty overalls and the wheelbarrow and the wood shavings. He stops them and he says to him, just stop there. He says, I need to know what you're doing because I need to sleep tonight so I don't lose my job so my wife won't leave me. Will you help me? I'll let you carry on doing whatever it is you're doing. Just tell me what you're doing so I can get to sleep. The guy says, all right, I'll tell you. You promise I can keep doing it? And the guard says, fine, whatever. I'll lose my credibility and my integrity, but at least I'll have a marriage and I'll have a job. So the guy says, okay, I'll tell you. I'm stealing wheelbarrows. Every day he'd been bringing a new but muddied wheelbarrow past the guard, but the guard didn't see it. Here's my question. Why? Why didn't the guard see it? Was the evidence clear? Was the crime happening in front of him? Why didn't the guard see it? Stories where things are hidden in plain sight reveal to us that it's not just whether or not the evidence is there in front of us, but also how strongly our own perspectives shape what we're looking at. Sometimes the evidence can be completely clear, but our lens that we see the world through, or our mental lens, can shape things so that we can't see. I find that talking to people about faith, talking to people about God, talking to people about Jesus, needs to include being aware of the lens that people are coming from. And so this session is all about thinking about how we see the world, thinking about how we understand the world. I'm going to talk about different lenses. I'm going to talk about becoming aware of lenses that people use. I've got a video clip to show you of a short film about lenses that we look at the world through. And then hopefully we'll get to some of your questions in a bit. But let's start with just reflecting briefly on why do we want to engage with lenses, and why would it be important to engage with lenses? Can I invite you to turn to the people sitting next to you? If you haven't met them yet, say hi. And could you ask this question? When you imagine sharing your Christian story with somebody, what stops you? What are you afraid of coming up, or what are you worried about? Okay. I would advise you, while those things are still fresh, make a little note of them. What are the barriers for you? What are the things that stop you? Just make a little note somewhere, or just make a mental note. Try to remember that. What is the difficulty? What would stop you? Because often we want to share our faith. We want to talk to people about where they look for hope, and where they look for something to keep them going, and where they look for forgiveness and a way out of shame that we've found in Jesus. But there are things that can sometimes stop us, and rather than just ignoring the negatives or ignoring the barriers, I think bringing things into the light means that we can talk about them and find ways through them. That's what the hostage negotiator, Chris Voss, says, who top FBI hostage negotiator. He said, you might think that negotiating with terrorists and pretty dangerous actors, as he calls them, you might think that you just sort of leave the negatives out of the conversation in a negotiation like that. But he said, no, bring the negatives in, and it allows you to talk about them. It allows you to have an engagement with them. Bring the things that stop you into a conversation, acknowledge them, talk about them, and thank you for your honesty with each other in talking about some of those things that might stop you. We will take phone translation questions later on. Sharing your faith involves all kinds of things, and engaging with somebody's perspective, somebody's lens involves all kinds of things. And we might be better in some of these areas than others, but I think it can involve building friendships, real genuine friendships, where we're interested in a person, not just because we want to convert them, but because we genuinely want to know them and want to be friends with them. So I think maybe the challenge for you is being more friendly. Maybe you've only got Christian friends and you need to have some hobbies and make some more friends. Ask yourself that question. It's sometimes a challenging question to ask. There's no formula here. Just be friendly and have real friendship. And good friendship's often based around listening well, really engaging with people, listening to them carefully. I find the conversations and the friendships for me that are deepest are those that are based around really careful, loving listening. Your cooking can be your mission field. Some of you, I'm sure, are amazing cooks. We've enjoyed some fantastic cooking today. But your ability to open a table up and to invite people into your space, to give them a space where they can feel comfortable, could be actually one of the greatest missional outreach gifts you can give. I often find just giving people a space where they can have a freedom to just talk a bit and just to be actually is slightly unusual in this world, and people really open up in that. Sometimes it will also involve sharing our story, and I'm going to give you a few tips to do that in a bit, but it might also involve engaging with questions. So we're principally thinking about how we speak, how we answer questions, how we engage with people's thinking, how we engage with people's ideas and their doubts, their longings, their questions. And I want to now think again about this idea of lenses that the guard on the gate of the factory is wrestling with in a way, or is under the effect of, let's say. So I'm going to talk about what lenses are, and then I'm going to explain why we need to engage with lenses. And then I'm going to talk about how we can journey with other people in thinking through their lenses. So 3 quick stages. And here's a little video that my friend Tom Cousins made. His film company Owl in Space made it. It's a short, 2-minute video, and it just explains this concept of the lens that we look at the world through. It will work. Do I need to click it again, or are you on it? Shall I? Okay. It was me.
Each eye has a unique mix of senses, which means that we see light, shape, and movement in our own unique way. This uniqueness becomes especially clear when it comes to visual impairments. For example, Monet's paintings had such fantastical colours, because of the nuclear cataracts developing in his eyes, which absorb light, desaturate colours, and give the world a yellow tinge. Like looking through a kaleidoscope where the same image is seen from multiple angles, there is a beauty within the diversity of perspectives that we see, which I think is similar to the diversity of perspectives that we have on life. But we might find that this diversity of perspectives that we have could make it hard to work out what we're actually seeing. A little bit like putting in 2 pairs of contact lenses at once. I think our surroundings are experienced through lenses which influence or even distort what we see. Stephen Hawking explained that in Italy, goldfish bowls were once actually banned due to their curved sides, which caused the fish to have a warped view of reality. It was thought to be cruel for the fish to have a false perspective of the truth. Hawking wonders, how do we know that we have the true, undistorted picture of reality? We must acknowledge the beauty in diversity. But I think that when we search for truth, we need to account for our biases, our fishbowls, our lenses. So I ask, what is your lens?
Saying the same question is to ask, how do you see the world? And there are different ways that people see the world. Another way to talk about this concept is the idea of worldview. That's the word that we use in philosophy quite often to talk about the lens that we see the world through. Have you ever heard of the word worldview before? Anybody heard of that? Yeah. So worldview is a word that we use to describe a view of reality, a view of the world. And there are different elements in a worldview, and it forms like an underlying scaffolding, like a network or a grid that shapes the way that we look at the world. It's like a lens we look at the world through, or a window that we look at the world through. If you say to somebody, what do you think about Jesus, or what do you think about the evidence for Jesus, or what do you think of my Christian story that I've just shared with you? They will quite often respond both to what you've said, but also from their lens or from their worldview. It will be a combination of both. And actually being aware of it and having conversations about it, engaging with it, can be extremely helpful, both for them and for you. The ideas that we believe, the worldviews and the lenses that we hold, don't just stay in our heads, but they actually affect the world. They impact our experiences, they impact the choices we make, they are the grid that we process the world through. The philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein says this: these underlying webs of belief serve as the axis, the riverbed, the scaffolding, and the hinges of the way that we understand the world. I thought some of you who are philosophers might enjoy that. In other words, it's almost like the framework that we see the world through. And these frameworks can be made up of different elements. They can be comprised of our emotional needs and longings. They can be comprised by different spiritual beliefs that we might have. They can be connected to our spiritual moral state, like what we're willing to believe, what we're happy believing, what we're able to believe. It can also be that they're impacted by psychology and our psychological background, a bit like doubts of the emotions. Imagine if you had a father who was an unkind, cruel person. Imagine that you had a parent who was just not very nice. If I propose to you now that we consider the idea of God as a loving father, are you not going to see it through that lens? Is it not going to impact the idea of you trusting and being close to God as a father if your father was just awful? Also, our community, our traditions, our background, that all impacts the way we understand and hear things. Politicians are continuously appealing using words that connect to older stories and traditions and backgrounds to try to pull in our interest into what they're saying and our agreement. What we do also impacts our worldview and our lens. the courses you've taken, the things you've studied, the jobs you've done, the skills you've picked up. Sometimes you might do like a course at work on first aid or on conflict management or on negotiation or on projects. It'll all shape all the other things you do. You'll like suddenly find yourself project managing the kids or using conflict de-escalation as you're trying to clear up the room the children are in for the crash. And our personality types too. We sometimes we're feelers, sometimes we're thinkers, sometimes we're a bit of both. I'm a bit of both. And then underlying that, we can also have our very close personal beliefs. You know, this idea that, an example of which might be an idea like, just keep calm and carry on. That's like a personal creed. You've seen that on a few tea towels and cushions, I'm sure. Another belief people might have is, don't trust anyone, or no regrets. These can become almost like the operating system through which we view everything. When I was a kid, I went away to boarding school when I was about 8 or 9 years old. I didn't want to go away to school, found it quite hard, quite traumatic. And then I had a series of other experiences in my adolescent years where people let me down quite badly. And I ended up entering my early 20s, and I had come to the conclusion that other people weren't safe. You couldn't trust other people. You could only really, and only in a limited way, trust yourself, but you couldn't really trust anybody. And that meant then when I met my wife and we started dating, a healthy relationship, that meant that I started having panic attacks because I had this deep operating belief of other people aren't safe, yet I wanted to trust her and I wanted to grow a relationship with her. Sometimes the things in our worldviews or our lenses can impact us and can shape us. Now, amazingly, I went through a journey of therapy, and it helped to heal and unpack and bring that stuff into the light and look at the reasons for it, and I began to be free and have been free from experiencing that. And I moved my belief from other people aren't safe to some people are safe, which I think is more reasonable. Some people are still not safe, but some people can be safe. You can trust other people. And so we have different layers to our lenses. Now, some of the lenses and some of the layers that we see the world through are quite everyday. I'm going to skip through slides here just for the sake of time and clarity. Some of this is philosophy, and that is not massively relevant. Okay, so we have these like everyday lenses that we see the world through. And if you want to go back to the philosophy later, you can ask about it, that's fine. But we have these everyday lenses that we see the world through. And I've just come up with 4 that I think are quite common at the moment, these ways of seeing the world. So one lens people have, and they sort of live through this lens and live through this worldview, is that things are getting worse. Was it trying to remember the character in Dad's Army who it was Fraser who said, "We're all doomed." That was his sort of saying, if you remember it. The world's getting worse. The world's not going better. And there are modern versions of this, aren't there? Where you watch the news or you see what's happening politically, geopolitically, and you see what's going on in the Middle East, you see what's going on in Ukraine, and everything then supports your conclusion. And all those micro stories support your underlying worldview, your underlying lens. So there's this view sometimes that everything's getting worse, we're all doomed. Now, if you're talking to somebody and sharing your faith with somebody who has that perspective, you need to emphasize and be aware that that's where they're coming from, that's their mindset, that's their lens. And you might find that there are specific questions that they ask that are different from somebody who holds a different lens, who might say, everything's getting better, things are getting better and better, we're using technology, we're using the free market, everything's getting better and better. Before you know it, Elon Musk will be, I don't know, walking around on Mars in a spacesuit with a robotic dog. Who knows? Things are getting better and better. Science is going to rescue us from everything. And there's the promise now, isn't there, that we might be able to transfer ourselves into robot bodies and be able to actually survive our own deaths. That's what some people called transhumanists are offering. So these kind of promises can be quite exciting. and people can connect to them. Other people might say, no, it's all part of the cycle. Things go round and round. We were having some conversations about this over lunchtime. Sometimes people will believe that things go round and round, and you need to just accept that, and that will help you, and that's the lens through which you view everything. Another very popular point of view at the moment, and forgive the long word, is something we might call therapeutic individualism. In other words, what this really means is I'm searching for my true self. And this is the lens. This is repeated in 100,000 YouTube videos, TikToks, and Instagram posts. Believe in yourself, know yourself, discover yourself, and then you will actualize, and then you will be empowered and authentic. We no longer look to a creator to authenticate us by knowing about them. We now authenticate ourselves because we are the creators of our own identities. We're the ones who are activating ourselves. So the highest goal now for many in this lens is to find the hidden self, find and cultivate the self. So our lens might be a combination of our mindset, our experiences, our mentality. It's very much a view that we have when we're playing with the kids, when we are doing quite practical things in the mundane areas of life, but it can go quite deep, and it can connect even into the personal creeds that we adopt. Every single statement on that slide is something people have told me or shared with me that has been a massive barrier in their life. It's been a massive challenge in their life that has impacted them in terms of breaking off engagements, that has seen the breakdown of marriages, that has seen people trying to find ways to deal with things. And they've often, people and their freedom and their growth as Christians has depended quite often on engaging at that level. So a lens can be like quite heady, quite intellectual, but it also can go right down into the internal attitudes of the heart. And I think God is interested in both. He's interested in big picture true truth. And I think he's also interested in, Jesus asks people questions like, what were you thinking in your hearts as we walked along? I see you said to yourself in your heart this. He's interested in that layer, isn't he? Okay, so that's what lenses are, and why engage with lenses is what I want to talk about now before I get you talking to each other a bit more. Why engage with lenses? Well, lenses are part of the way that we see the world. This is the tent peg passage really for apologetics that I quoted earlier when I was being introduced this morning. In your hearts set apart Christ as Lord, and be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have, but do this with a gentleness and respect. Paul later justifies his ministry with this passage. He says this, for though we live in the world, sorry the text is a bit small, hopefully reading it will help you. For though we live in the world, we do not wage war as the world does. The weapons we fight with are not the weapons of the world. On the contrary, they have a divine power to demolish strongholds. Now, just pause there for a moment. Paul is writing to justify how he is reaching out and what his spiritual ministry is. Paul is explaining how his ministry works. And he is saying that God has given him spiritual tools and given us spiritual tools that are designed to help engage the world and to take the gospel forwards into the world. It's not prayer walking, his answer. It's not. I mean, we might be expecting him to say, campaigns, or we might be expecting him to say some sort of, community that lives out their faith. I'm sure all these things are part of the picture. It's not enthusiastic worship or truly biblical, clear gospel proclamation. No, it's conversations where he's engaging with ideas. On the contrary, they have a divine power to demolish strongholds. We demolish arguments and every pretension that sets itself up against the knowledge of God, and we take captive every thought to make it obedient to Christ. In other words, talking to people about what they believe in their lenses is a deeply spiritual practice. It is not unspiritual to do thinking. Paul is saying here, that the actual business of talking to people about what they believe is one of the most spiritual things you can do with a person. Thinking about your questions, thinking about your kind of objections and your own worries about faith, it's deeply spiritual. This is part of how God meets us. This is one of the tools in the tool belt that God has given us for engaging with ourselves, engaging with Him, and engaging with the world. So, why do engagement with lenses? Why not just preach the gospel to people? Well, because actually people have questions. And it's spiritual to engage with people's questions. That's what those verses from 1 Corinthians 10 say. And we can speak gospel truth into their questions. It's not the gospel or questions and worldviews. It's both and. We can, through their questions and through a conversation about how they see the world, we can explain the gospel into their need. And we can help them then invitationally to explore a relationship with God, which is where my heart is. I want to talk to people about real things, about what they're living for. And I want to help them to discover God in a way that it's not trickery, it's not manipulation. I want them to truly, genuinely ask their questions and seek and find that God is real and he's as good as I've experienced Him to be. People are asking all kinds of questions too. These are some of the most popular questions at the moment that people are going to ChatGPT and they're asking ChatGPT these questions. What's the meaning of life? How can I find happiness and fulfillment? What's my purpose in life? How can I overcome my fears and anxieties? How can I deal with loneliness and isolation? How can I improve my self-confidence? How can I forgive myself and others? And how can I deal with grief and loss? It's quite interesting, isn't it? Just how those questions are quite practical. I'm sure you would feel like actually you'd have some answers to those questions. So that does perhaps give you pause for thought and thinking, actually, you could probably be quite useful in conversations if you met somebody who was asking one of those questions. You could actually really help them. So that's the why of why we want to engage with people's lenses, because people have questions and there's a need there, and God's given spiritual tools to engage, and it's a biblical command to engage and to give reasons. So hopefully that's useful. So how can we go about journeying with others? Okay, I'm going to give you a bit of practical work to do now. Okay. Could you perhaps find something that you could note down on, or if you're very organized and you've got a notepad, would you mind just tearing up a little bit of a sheet and just sharing a few sheets around with you on the table? I mean, I know we don't have pens and notebooks these days, do we, very much? We've got phones. You can use your phone to make notes, that's fine. Could I ask you to try to write down your answers to these 3 questions? Okay, first question is, Before you came to this point where you are with God right now, what were you looking for or what were you running from? Maybe it was before you were a Christian, or maybe it was at an earlier point in your Christian life where there wasn't quite the same connection you have with God today. Maybe you always grew up as a Christian, but maybe there was a moment where you realized, actually, I need to own this for myself, like Timothy was encouraged to do by Paul. Fan into flame the gift that you have from your grandmother and from your mother. Was there a point before which you weren't really choosing God, or you hadn't really realized that was your choice to make? Or maybe you weren't a Christian and you can remember, actually, you were looking for purpose, you were looking for an answer. Could you just note down how you felt at that moment, where you were? Like what a couple of words that would just describe it. Feel free to talk to the people next to you, to ask them if they're struggling or if they got something, and then maybe help them if they're struggling. Okay, here's the next question. Next question is, what happened? Was there a moment where God broke in, where you met God, where you realized that the gospel was calling you to a relationship with God, that Jesus had seen you and you became aware of him in some way? Try to just note down, okay, what happened then? Just a word to remind you or some way to describe that moment. So there was the moment before. Now this is the moment meeting God. This is the moment where God broke in, or God somehow maybe pressed upon you. Maybe you were 6 years old and it was in Sunday school and you were choosing Jesus. That's cool. You don't have to have a testimony where you're like me, sort of this disgruntled philosophical atheist. It's cool if you were 6 years old and you were in Sunday school and you just realized that Jesus loved you. That's cool. That's your answer. That's a blessing, actually. So the before, then what happened now. It's really important we do the next bit and we're truthful. Really important to be truthful next. So what happened then? What happened after? What's still a struggle, but what actually has changed? We want to avoid making it sound like Jesus came down in a heavenly chariot and took away all our problems, because that's not true. Because we still struggle, we're still in a world of some toil and tears. Okay, so you've got a before, you've got what happened, and now you should have an after. I'm going to give you 2 minutes, and I'd like you to share that with somebody on the table with you. I'd like you to take it in turns and just listen to each of your little stories. What happened? Okay, I want to leave a bit of time for questions in the end. I hope that was encouraging. Isn't it nice to hear people's stories of what God's been doing? It's actually really nice. And what you're beginning to realize, and probably already you knew this, but we have amazing stories of what God has been doing in each other's lives. I wonder what would happen if we were open to sharing that story that you just shared. I wonder what would happen if we prayed, each week, Lord, give me an opportunity to share my story this week of what you did, of who you are, who I've discovered you to be. Do you ever pray when you get on a bus or on a train? Do you ever pray, Lord, set me next to the right person? And then do you pray with an openness, saying, look, I'm not just praying it, Lord. I'm not going to put the headphones straight in, I promise. I will actually say hi and ask them, are you traveling for work, or are you going on holiday? Are you having a nice day? How are you doing? I'm challenging you a little bit here, aren't I? I don't believe in formulas, and I think a quick way to make a conversation pretty weird and unnatural is to have a formula. Instead, I would just say, talk to people, be open, be warm, be friendly. Talk about meaningful things. If you're an introvert, push yourself a bit out of your shell and be available to engage with people. You can go back afterwards, it's fine. You can go back to the cave. I'm an introvert, I get it. If you're an extrovert, make sure you're listening as much as you're speaking. It's great to hear your point of view, but it's also awesome to ask people questions and listen to the responses. Talk about meaningful things. Don't just talk about, we love the weather, don't we? We love talking about the weather. It's a very interesting conversation. We love talking about football too, but there are also more meaningful, I know, there are more meaningful things in the world. And we can talk about them. And if we gently hold our perspectives, then we can involve other people in those conversations too. Knowing what the gospel is, knowing with clarity about the message of life that comes through Christ dying for our sins on the cross, and knowing how that's impacted you. I mean, you're ready to have conversations now, aren't you? Okay, next layer of engaging with people's lenses. One layer is telling our story. Another layer is being open to the conversation. The final layer I want to suggest to you is being open to asking and receiving questions. So we might ask questions when we sit down and talk to people. What do you think God's like? This is like a few questions you could use to transition a superficial conversation to a slightly deeper conversation. You need to be the judge of whether this is natural or whether this would be clunky gear change or not. But I always think, well, you can always back off a bit. You can always say, this is going to sound like a weird question, but hey, what do you reckon God is like? What's your impression of God? Have you ever had an idea about what God thinks of you? What do you think of Jesus? Have you ever found out what's your impression of him? What box do you put him in? That's how to take conversations to a slightly different place, but you may find that people ask you questions. And asking questions and talking about questions is a really good approach because it focuses things a bit more, it helps bring some clarity, you can sort of talk about the main thing quite often, but it also helps you to expose and understand where people are coming from. And we always talk about how there's a question quite often behind the question that people ask. And that follows, doesn't it, from the idea of a lens and from those experiences I was describing that shape what we're looking at. So when you hear somebody ask you a question or say something to you about faith or about science or about Jesus or about church, always be thinking, I wonder what their question is under this thing they've said. I wonder what the underlying question in their heart is. And you can ask, what makes you ask that? What causes you to ask that? I'd love to know more about where you're coming from with that. Okay, finally, I want to talk about the Jesus lens. And I want to talk about how Jesus' lens is not a religious lens. It's actually at its center a relationship. And this is one of the things I would try and emphasize when you're talking to somebody and having the conversation. You say, we've all got these lenses we look at the world through, but one of the things to get across to them is to say, Christian faith, if you understand the Christian lens, it's not a religion, but it's a rescue, it's a relationship, it's a revelation. And at the center of Christianity is Christ. That's, if you take nothing else away from this conversation in your understanding of Christian faith, Christianity is about Christ, who is fully human and fully God. And at the center of his message, at the center of the Jesus lens, is that he lived a perfect life. He healed and he taught with great authority, but he died on the cross to deal with our sin. And he rose from the dead, and he comes now with the power of the Holy Spirit to infuse and empower our lives. And it's a sign that we can have relationship with God. It's what makes relationship with God possible. So at the center of the Jesus lens is relationship, is rescue, and it's being loved and known by God. Okay. I want now to give some space for you to ask some questions and for you to be able to reflect on some of what you've heard. And there are a few questions that Jeff and I have mentioned that you might like to ask about. And I've heard from a few of you that there are things you might like to ask about. So let's spend the rest of the time. You can quiz me, you can ask for pointers on some of these ideas I've just shared. What would be helpful for you to ask about? I'd love to hear your point of view. Do we need to use the microphone so people on the stream can hear or on the recording can hear? How do you want to do it, guys? Okay, great. So if you have a question, a comment, an observation, if you'd like to ask about how do you handle it when that question comes up, you can ask about anything you like. That's fine.
Hi, Tom.
Hi, Lou.
Just jumping straight in, I think one of the biggest questions that comes up is, I'm interested in your view on, when people talk about their miserable lives and how they feel let down, and why does God allow them to live in such difficult times? How would you handle that one?
Can I ask, just before I jump in with an answer, or an attempt at an answer, do you think the challenge in this question is feeling that things aren't meaningful, or is it the suffering? Because they're both in there, aren't they?
I understand that experiences are meaningful, even very difficult experiences are meaningful, but sometimes you meet people who aren't in that place where they're prepared to acknowledge that that's a meaningful experience. To them, it's just pain.
Yeah. When people are going through stuff, sometimes the reason for that is because they're right in pain right now. And giving them, like a nice comparative answer of different responses to suffering among the world's religions, or even the Christian theological response, is not what they really need. They just need a friend, and they just need you to be with them. And so when we're answering suffering questions and questions that are to do with this sort of difficulty navigating sense of meaninglessness and purposelessness in life, it can be that the answer is more something relational we need to do rather than an answer we need to give. Having said that, if we were going to start to give an answer as well as doing the appropriate relational, caring response, I think I would approach it in two ways. I think I would say, look, there are every different perspective in the world has to wrestle with and try to deal with the problem of pain and the problem of suffering and the problem of what life means when we go through pain. Is there another reason for it? Is there something to hope in? Every different perspective in the world offers an answer to that or attempts to wrestle with that. The framework of Buddhism is built around Gautama seeing the 4 distressing sights. Somebody aging, somebody unwell, somebody in pain, and somebody dead. And Buddhism is in part an attempted response to the problem of suffering. Now, where it goes is to say suffering is caused by desire and frustrated desire. And if we release desire, then we won't experience suffering in the same sort of way. So its answer is through detachment. We won't experience desire, and then we won't experience suffering in the same way. Other responses, like atheism, which is also attempting and has attempted to answer the problem of suffering, essentially gives you the hard fact of the universe. It's just chance plus matter plus time. There isn't a meaningfulness. All you exist to do is to propagate your DNA. That is the meaning of your life. Propagate DNA. If you're successful in doing that, then maybe you could say your life was successful. Maybe it wasn't. Christian faith says, by contrast, it says, there is a God who intended your existence, who made you and knew your name before he made you, who cares for you, who died for you, who wants to be in relationship with you, who knows the hairs on your head. And not only has this God seen that the world is suffering, he hasn't stood back and said, I don't care, I'm going to let you sort it out by either whatever strategy you human beings come up with. This God has stepped into history to almost enter into the bitterness of meaningless of existence sometimes without God, and to absorb sin and to bring justice. Essentially, in a way, the cross is God saying enough to suffering. I'm going to remake the world through my judgment, and I'm going to bring things to an account. And the goal of the cross is God with his people and a world without death, without suffering, without pain, without that disconnection from God that is the fundamental cause of meaninglessness. We were created in the Garden of Eden to be meaningful. And when we fell and when we become disconnected from God and alienated from God, we lose that connection to our purpose and our sense of meaning. But actually, in the Garden of Eden, we are given a job description which contains some of the meaning for our lives. The problem is we're trying to live out that meaning quite often without reference to that and without reference to God. But the actual original job description is in Genesis 1, verses 26, 27, 28. And it talks about how we are to fill the earth and multiply, to subdue it and to steward the earth. And essentially, it is the responsibility that's given to human beings to be civilization and culture builders. We're meant to build cities, we're meant to build businesses, we're meant to build infrastructures, we're meant to legislate, we're meant to create an orderly world reflecting God's creative gift that he's given us in the world. We're meant to reflect his good gift in creation. And we're meant to have cities, we're meant to, all this stuff. There's a divine purpose to it. It's not as a result of the fall. God's instruction to us is do all of this stuff, but do it in relationship with me and do it in a way that reflects me and honors me. Which is why we look out of the window and we're making cars and we're creating businesses and countries, and that's why we do this stuff. It's the stuff that we can't help but do, but we're doing it without a connection to God, and we're doing it without knowing why we're doing it, because we've forgotten what Genesis 1 says. And so we're doing it without roots and we're doing it without relationship, and that causes meaninglessness. But there is a God who steps into the cost and the alienation and the brokenness of doing it without God. There is a God who steps into that and rescues us from the consequences of that. And that's what the cross is about. Thank you for the question.
You wouldn't let me down.
Hi.
The opposite side to this question.
somebody I would be talking to, say they're really happy in their life, they don't really want for anything, need for anything, they have meaning in their life. How would we then make Christianity a good prospect for them when they're very happy in their own life?
Yeah, it's hard to commend something on the basis of fulfilling a need that they're already having fulfilled. Well, this is the problem of commending Christian faith on the basis of it meeting needs rather than it being the truth. We've got to come back to truth. I don't think the approach we should make to such a person is to say you don't have true meaning because it's not connected to God. It's sort of almost to sort of make them almost belittle their sense of meaning, because it might be that they're doing amazing things. It might be that they're setting up orphanages and hospitals and caring for people in ways that many of us in this building would be like, if I could do that, that would be amazing. So they may be having more of an impact in the world in terms of doing good things, and there may be more actually of a meaning to their lives than some of the self-centered stuff that I get baked into. So I don't want to cut off what might be legitimate and real meaning that they're doing, but I think I would want to say that I would almost want to take the lid off the ceiling, the roof off the ceiling, and I would want to say what you're doing is meaningful, but it's not just meaningful in the way that you think it's meaningful. It's meaningful because there's a God who made you to do that and who sees what you're doing, and he can help you and does that with you. So I'd want to work with the direction they're moving in. You know, they may feel that they're doing meaningful things. It may be that they're just actually being frivolous, and what they feel life is all about is just being happy and being on the yacht and, you know, flying around the place and having, you know, providing for the family, and that it's all quite sort of insular. In which case, I don't think I want to come to that in judgment and say, that's selfish, that's not meaningful. I think instead I want to come and say, is there truth? Is it really true? Is there something that's true about this faith? Also, to an extent, I was really privileged. I grew up in quite a wealthy part of the world in the South, and next door neighbours were sort of football players and people who managed well-known bands and things. And I've seen how their kids look at their lives. And most rock stars' kids and most wealthy trust fund owners' kids are pretty messed up because there isn't a sense of really being meaningful in the world. So I actually think that often there can be a question about, is there a deeper meaning that's being missed out on? Is there something more meaningful that you're yearning for? And I often find that purchase has, that question has some purchase in the conversation. Do you ever, you know, people look at you outwardly and say you've got everything, and you know, you do say sometimes you feel you have everything you need, but do you not yearn actually to be loved, to be known, to be accepted, to find a way through, to deal with the mistakes you've made? Do you find there's a yearning in you for God? I do think that if we go down the road of appealing to needs and felt needs, we do get into this kind of slightly odd conversation about, they can say, no, I'm just content as I am. And actually we know that the gospel and the truth of God does not depend and is not judged on the basis of whether or not they're content in their life or whether or not they're willing to admit there's something missing. It might help to open the door a bit to reflect on that, but the truth of it's not based on that. So instead I'm going to come back to Jesus is still true even if you found other ways to satisfy yourself in life. And it's more important, truth is more important, and the truth of God is more important than whether or not you're comfortable. I sometimes tell the illustration, the story of a story that's called One Mug. And the story of One Mug goes like this. One Mug is a student, and he is a physics he's a kid. He starts to do physics at school, at primary school, at the end of his primary school, and he barely scrapes a GCSE in his secondary education in physics. But the teacher has a particularly cruel streak and decides instead to mark his paper and to give him an A in physics. And he's so encouraged by this that One Mug decides to do physics A-level. The same teacher gets to mark the A-level, gives him an A again, and recommends that he goes on to be a scholar at university. Sends a letter to a friend of his who's a professor at a university, and the professor gets in on the scam, and One Mug is going to the exams. He's given terrible answers, but the teachers are marking it as the most amazing answers ever. Eventually, One Mug goes to university, he gets a degree in physics, he eventually gets a master's, he does a PhD. Eventually, he's becoming a professor in physics, and the British government are in on the whole game, and they're flying him all over the world, and it's all an enormous joke at One Mug's expense. When he leaves the nuclear facilities that he's been asked to go and consult on, they get the real physicists to come in and they talk to him, and they talk about the real issues, and it's just so different from what he's been talking about. And essentially he goes around and he's got a family and they don't know what's going on either, but everybody apart from One Mug and his family are in on the scam, in on the joke. And everybody's laughing at him going, that guy thinks he's so clever, he's actually an idiot. And the question is, for the contented One Mug, who's got everything he wants, he's got a good salary, a good home, he's got meaning, he's doing things that give him a sense of meaning. The question is, would you choose his life? Would you choose his life for your kids? And if you say, well, okay, no, I don't think I would because it's actually not based on reality, it's not true, it's a mirage of meaningfulness, then you're saying that there's one thing that's more important than whether or not something feels meaningful or works for you, it's whether or not it's actually true.
Any more questions? Oh, Laurie, yeah.
Hi, Laurie.
Hi, so I'm going to pull on your philosophy a little bit, if you don't mind.
Sure.
So I spend a lot of time talking with people from my family that I wish would sort of follow over, and they tend to take this, what I would call a circular worldview. Sort of like the secularists would fall into this, where when you break it down to the epistemology, or the justification for any of their axioms, it all falls apart. It just, well, it is because I say it is. How would you deal with that without being too pushy, is probably the best way I could put it, because my sister, my mother, my father, everyone in my family is secularist other than me and my local family. So we're trying to broaden the horizons of our family as much as we can, and everyone tends to fall into this. Well, I think because I think, and when you try and break that down philosophically, I tend to use the transcendental argument with most of my family members because they have a relative understanding of it, but they also just boldly say, no, absolutely not. This is the way I think because I think it is. How would you dissect that in a more polite way than I probably would, frankly?
Let me repeat back what I think I've heard the question to be. How do you deal with people maybe close to you who they're perhaps open to some philosophical discussion, but then they get to a point in the conversation where they slightly shut it down and they say, I just think this. Yeah. Why do you reckon they can't give you a further justification?
I think at some point, without your sort of the biblical structure that we go by, or the ethical system that we stand by, things tend to fall apart quite quickly. I spent most of my life as an Odinist, so I understand that morals from a subjective point of view don't tend to go too well. Especially with my father and my younger sister, they both say, well, this is wrong. You say, okay, can you justify why that's wrong? And they go, well, because I think it's wrong. Okay, well, I've got a book here with 2,000 years of history that can tell me why that's right and why that's wrong. Can you do the same? Or is this where this argument falls apart? And I try and be as nice as I can, but I'm also relatively blunt.
So what we sometimes can find ourselves doing in these conversations is setting it up like this, where I have the evidence, I've got the reasonable belief structure, I've got the foundationalist account of my metaphysics, if you like, in the language of philosophy. I've got these reasons and I've got this justification for my perspective. And then we engage with other people and we've almost slightly stacked the deck where we're looking for inconsistencies and we're looking for logical problems and we're looking for circularity in what they're saying. I wonder whether that setting up of things might cause a almost hardening of the postures, where you basically end up being in these two different castles that are next to each other, throwing hand grenades over the wall, and nobody's really acknowledging. When was the last time something that was true on your side was acknowledged by the other side? And when was the last time you acknowledged something that was true on their side?
I'm quite willing to accept pretty much anything as fact.
Yeah.
If there's any kind of evidence for
Yeah.
it, or if there's any kind of philosophical backing, if
Great.
you like. I've accepted many things from both of my parents and
Great.
my siblings on this front. Sort
Yeah.
of, well, this is how I view it.
I think
So,
power
okay,
to that.
I understand the view, but I don't agree with the view.
Yeah.
So that's where we fall apart, is I can justify and say, well, I don't agree with that, and this is why.
Yeah.
Whereas they say, I don't agree with you because I'm right. You go,
Yeah.
okay.
And you know, it might be worth you recognizing, and this might help to give them. I think probably most of us would agree with where you're coming from, and we would probably like affirm the reasoning you're using. But I wonder if there's a way people could pick up the fact that, you know, you're just asserting that because you say you're right. I wonder whether that could in some way cause a hardening of the postures. Here's how I like to approach these sorts of conversations where people are kind of in their bunkers a little bit. I like to say, look, I've got false beliefs, mistaken beliefs. I need to learn things from you. And I recognize that I've got areas in my life where I just assume things are true. And I think if that can be the first step, then you've almost set up things differently, where you're already creating an acknowledgement that we need to work together in figuring out what's true together. I need you to help me to think through my faith more, even though you don't share it. I would love to understand more of how you come at it from. Because I think you've got gifts of truth, as you said, to share with me, and I'm sure that's how you approach it. But making it explicit and sort of saying, look, let's approach it in this way. Let's have less of the kind of, I think you're wrong, but let's have more of this kind of learning together approach. I would almost actually think that, phone questions, excellent. I would almost step back from trying to persuade them. I know your heart is desperate and you really want them to understand and to come to know Jesus and to find faith. I would suggest that prayerfully you give that to God and you let God have that and you hand that over to God. Let him be responsible for them. Don't take that on you. Instead, journey with them as they journey with you, learning from each other, walking together in life, less persuading each other and more walking with. And I think the way that people change beliefs is in often a de-escalated situation. And this sounds escalated to me. It sounds like there's argument, there's back and forward, you're right, you're wrong, you know. And I would almost back off from that. Maybe you could go back to that in a year or two, maybe back to that in some months, but I would instead, I would almost like put it on the back burner a bit and say, I've been thinking about this, can you help me think this through? And just genuinely not try to persuade them it's true, just back off from it. Let them indicate they're open to the conversation at appropriate moments. They know what you believe now. Let God and pray for God to work by his Holy Spirit that they might be led to ask their own questions, not trying to sort of open the door for them, but waiting for God to draw them and appeal to them. I think the challenge for you, my friend, is prayer, giving it to God, and walking with, and just being aware that there is that desire in you for them to know the Lord, appropriately so. I mean, God bless you for wanting for them to know. But I think that's just too much for you to carry. And I think have some people around you that pray with you, that help you carry that. But I would just, see what I'm saying? It's more like, yeah. I've gone the long route with a number of people in my life. I've seen friends who over 15 years, and relatives over 15 years, have journeyed towards the Lord. I've seen other people's relatives and been involved in them coming to faith over a sort of 60-year journey of showing faith. God is a God who wants to reach people more than we do. He cares so much for your mum and dad. He cares so much for your family, for each of our families, and for those family members who don't yet know Jesus. And I think being aware of that helps us to trust him. And I have seen that God plays the long game with people. He played it with me. And he knows the moments in all of our lives where we, from the inside, open the door. That's Holman Hunt's picture, right? Jesus, light of the world. Haven't you made a mistake with your painting? Somebody asked him, apparently, when he painted the picture. And he said, no, the handle's on the inside. I think you've given them a good understanding now of the gospel. You can step back. Let God's Spirit work in this. God bless you. Thanks for the question.
We've got time for one more.
Brilliant.
Thank you. I just wanted to ask, when you have a friend who said they believe in Jesus, like you mentioned earlier, because of the evidence and things, so they come to the reality, okay, there's Jesus, but they don't believe there is a God, and you're trying to explain there's no Jesus without a God, and they don't understand that. How do you explain further? How do you convince them there's actually a God who orchestrated everything we have on earth today?
I think I would do it quite simply, and I would just say this. I'd say, if Jesus said and did that the things that the New Testament presents him doing are true, if that's true, if the New Testament is accurate history in its portrait and its picture of Jesus, so just describe it briefly. He fulfills prophecy outside of his control. He knows the future. He claims to come from God and to be the only one who knows the Father. He grows back people's physical limbs in plain sight. He heals incurable diseases. He drives out demons and exercises power over the demonic. He exercises power over the natural elements of the world, like storms and seas. He teaches with such authority that ethicists are still working on questions now of plumbing the depths of his teaching. If that picture of Jesus is correct and accurate, doesn't any reasonable person have to say God exists and Jesus is God? So the question then is that picture accurate? And that's where you could have a conversation about the evidence for the New Testament. They might push back and say, and this commonly is what people say, is, yeah, but I want God to reveal himself in the way I define that God would reveal himself. I want God to do this or that, or to reveal himself in a philosophy argument or in a test tube in a laboratory somewhere. But if God's God, we don't get to choose God's means of revelation. It's up to God. God can choose how he reveals. And we have to be amenable and open to whatever way that God would reveal. So I think I would go down the line of, and I think this is a really useful thing to say in conversations, is to say, look, that picture of Jesus in the New Testament, can any reasonable person not say God exists? I mean, this absolutely penned me when I was an agnostic atheist. I heard J.P. Moreland saying this before I became a Christian. And Moreland said something like, if the New Testament picture of Jesus is correct, doesn't any reasonable person have to say that that's God? And I was like, yeah, you got me, bro. Listen very carefully to how they push back, if they push back, and then pivot and address what they actually push back from. Might be historical, might be moral, might be they say, I want to decide how God reveals. Yeah. Thank you for some lovely questions.
I'm just conscious of the time.
Yeah, I need to jump on a train in a bit. Yeah.
You're right, you've got an hour.
I'm all right, okay.
So thank you everyone for coming today. Thank you Tom.
So welcome.
That was really interesting, and he's got a few minutes if you have any burning questions. But otherwise, I think it's been really good. So shall we just say thank you to Tom?
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Thank you for having me.
I just pray for us as we disperse. So Father, thank you for a great day. Thank you for stimulating thoughts. Thank you for good conversation. Lord, will you bless us now as we go into this week? May we go encouraged to ask good questions, to listen carefully to questions that we come across, and give us the courage to explore answers that point people to Jesus. We ask it in your precious name and for your glory. Amen. Thank you, guys.